Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. And yes, you will probably see my dog and possibly cat walking through the background. They're both very excited to be here today as well. So just to kind of kick us off, there we go. If you want your own copy of these slides, if that's a better way to kind of follow along, you can find them online, bit.ly/Android worldwide-doc if you prefer Google Slides, or a PDF version is available on my GitHub, bit.ly/Android worldwide-PDF. I know you mentioned at the beginning that you kind of got your start in accessibility, and so I wanted to just give everyone a little bit of background about me. And actually, I also got my start in Android in accessibility. So my first job was at a bank, and I was a very junior developer, having never worked on anything, let alone Android. And so one of my first roles on that particular project was to work with a team of accessibility experts and work on making this banking app more accessible. Kind of looking back on that experience, I'm often like, oof, they should not have let a child who barely knew how to use an Android device be responsible for such an important part of the application. But at the same time, so thankful now that I had that experience as a junior developer, and that's gave me a really solid foundation on building accessible applications. And I've kind of carried that throughout my career. Something that's really important to me is making tech more inclusive just in general. And so I'm really involved with organizations like Women Who Code Mobile. We would love to see some of you there as well. And then also using my technical expertise to make inclusive technology. So today, because we're a team of developers, myself included, we're going to talk about some very concrete technical ways to build accessible applications. But I definitely encourage everyone to consider other ways that their application may not be inclusive and ways that they can improve on that as well. And so that might include things like doing a review of all the copy in your application to make sure that you're using gender inclusive language. And then also looking through things like imagery in your app and making sure that you're not only showing one type of person or a single group of people. And I really think that all of these things go together because if we have more inclusive teams, this is also going to help us build more inclusive applications at the end of the day. And then I also, of course, want to remind everyone that building inclusive applications and building accessible applications is going to be a team effort. Again, today we're going to talk about practical implementations for developers because we are a virtual room full of developers. But most of the time, a single developer cannot individually contribute their way to an accessible app. And so we need our businesses to commit to the importance of building this kind of applications. We need our PMs on board to prioritize that work. We need our designers to create beautiful but accessible designs. We need our QA teams to know how to test these things for our features before we ship them to our users as well. And of course, we all need to be able to kind of know how to call out potential accessibility pitfalls as we build out our accessibility best practices. And so if you're wondering how to get that whole team on board, how to get your business on board, I wanted to quickly go over just a couple of different reasons that you can kind of present because building accessible apps can have very real impacts for your team financially, your number of users, legally, and many more. So first, building accessible apps means that more people can use your application. About 1 in 4 people worldwide have some kind of disability, and there are about 2 billion Android users, which means that 50 million Android users are going to have some kind of disability. And not only that, but a survey showed that folks are willing to spend more money if they can access your product easily. So they're actually willing to pay for those accessibility features, although I will very adamantly say that they shouldn't have to. And actually, over Christmas, Forbes published an article that stated that retailers lost over $800 million of sales over the holidays for their products being inaccessible. So again, very real impacts on your app financially and that number of users who can actually use your application. Next is risk management. In the words of Kim Creighton, the anti-racist economist, lack of inclusion is a risk management issue. And so the kind of flagship case that most people point to is the Domino's court case where a visually impaired man sued the chain the pizza chain after he was unable to order food on the Domino's website and the mobile application. And so that ruling actually said that both websites and mobile applications are public spaces and therefore must adhere to the ADA compliance. And so I don't think of this as a super fun reason, but it's often that first step to kickstart businesses into caring about accessibility. Next is it's going to be better for everyone. There are so many features that I think that I know I take for granted. They will be interspersed as examples throughout this presentation that make my life a lot easier, more convenient. The one that I always give to folks is that I can tab through forms because I'm super lazy and do not want to take my hands off the keyboard. Other things that we can think about is using camel case for hashtags. It makes it so much easier for me to be browsing Twitter, looking at everyone's hashtags and figuring out quickly what those words say versus if it's just one single word with everything in the same case. You can also think about like the curb cuts and sidewalks that make it super easy to pull your luggage into an airport, but in reality are again an accessibility feature for folks in wheelchairs. And then finally, my personal favorite, it's the right thing to do. And this time quoting Tatiana Mack, a web developer, teacher, and activist, compassionate action is better than empathy. And so adding accessibility support to your mobile applications is one concrete action that you can really take as a developer to make the world a better place. And so accessibility is not only going to be that nice thing to do, but it's going to increase the quality of your app as you make it more accessible. It's going to make it better for all your users. It's going to make it behave as the accessibility framework expects. And that in turn is going to make it behave in the consistent way that an Android app should behave. So let's start with going over a couple different types of disabilities that folks might face. So first we have motor impairments. And with any of these different impairments, it can really range from a minor impairment to a full impairment. And so if we think about motor impairments, this could range from wheelchair use that we just talked about with curb cuts to just having kind of shaky hands. And folks with motor impairments may use hardware devices like an accessibility switch to control the app or the accessibility menu. Cognitive impairments who may use action blocks to set up routines to make it easier to complete the tasks that they use often. Visual impairments that can range from things like color blindness to full blindness and may use increased text size in the application, a braille keyboard or talkback, and also deaf and hard of hearing. And so folks with deaf or hardness of hearing might use closed captioning, live transcribe, or live captioning. It's also important to remember that people can experience all of these, or any number of these at any varying degree. And so building an application for all of these, taking in mind all of these different types of disabilities will create an accessible application. And these are also only some of the different things that they can use to help make their user experience more robust. And so if you open your accessibility settings in your phone settings, you'll find other options that they might use to make it a more enjoyable experience on their mobile app. I think it's also important to note that able-bodied users like myself might face similar challenges under certain circumstances. And so while some people, and often what we think about is people born with a disability, people like me might also use some of these settings. And I would really encourage you to spend some time thinking about different situations where you might be in a situation or a temporary situation that you would need one of these. And so these are some of my personal examples of times that I fit into these different categories. For example, I often try to cook using recipes off my phone. And so when my hands get really dirty, I'm often trying to scroll up and down using my elbow or wrist. It does not work great. Or I also always point to closed captioning on TV shows to enable my very bad habits of staying up way too late at night and not disturbing anyone else in the house, including the cat and dog. And so these are some features that I often use on a regular basis. And so this chart is a really good rationale for why accessibility is so important. Is really that permanent category is the one we often think about, but in reality, there's a grid of all these other different ways that people might be affected and want to use these kind of features. And so with that, I wanted to talk very quickly about the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and why they matter for what we're going to talk about today. And then we'll start diving into some code and examples that are specific to mobile. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are a set of guidelines meant for improving web accessibility produced by the World Wide Web Consortium. The most recent version, v2.1, was released in 2018. And so the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines have 3 different tiers. The basic level of accessibility is tier A, and then we go up to double A. Double A tries to address the biggest and most complex barriers for users with disabilities. And then the final level is that triple A classification. And so that is significant improvements that are often complex for web accessibility. I just said web accessibility, the World Wide Web Consortium. And so the question here is, why do they matter for us? And what's important about these guidelines is that they're specifically designed around principles and not technologies. And so because of this, they can be applied to other frameworks as well, besides web. And so the principles of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are going to be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. In general, most companies kind of aim for that double A target because it's not always possible to reach triple A in every application. But it's important to remember that once you hit double A, you're not done, and you continue to work towards making your application more accessible, even if that triple A level is not possible. So today we're going to talk about both our classic traditional Android UI with XML and all of our favorite XML attributes, and then also some accessibility features of Jetpack Compose. I particularly think that it's a really good time to start learning about accessibility. Of course, noting that there's never a bad time to get started because so many of us are learning about Jetpack Compose and kind of shifting our mental mindsets already. And so with everyone learning about Jetpack Compose, it means that everyone is learning about accessibility all over again, myself included. And so there's a lot of really great content coming out around accessibility from folks in the community. And then also Google themselves have really put an emphasis on this in the last year or so. And we'll actually talk about some features of Jetpack Compose that show how Google is committed to making it a really accessible framework. And so today we'll show solutions in XML and then also how they port over to Jetpack Compose so that you can start adding accessibility features regardless of where your application is, and then also start to think about how to shift that mental model as we continue to move into the future of Android development. So while we will talk about some really specific different use cases and some of the most common pitfalls for accessibility, the important thing to remember is that it will not cover every different situation you might get into, and it will not cover every UI that you could build. And so the main goal of building an accessible UI is going to be providing a consistent experience for all of your users. And so if you do run into a situation where you maybe aren't sure what to do, or maybe isn't covered by any of the different accessibility guidelines or examples out there on the internet, I would urge you to try to find something similar in a Google first-party application. At the end of the day, many of our applications are some kind of list of data displayed in different and interesting ways that make sense for our users. And so looking to these first-party apps, looking at their accessibility settings, looking at how they implement these different things should kind of give you that guideline for what a consistent behavior is across applications. And again, by producing a consistent application that makes sense for the accessibility framework is going to make your experience better for everyone. New users are going to be able to quickly become familiar with your application. They're going to know how to intuitively use it, and that's going to let them make the most of your application quicker than in a different scenario. Okay, so we're going to first start about testing the application, which might seem a little bit backwards, but the reason that we have to look at how to test first is because we first need to know how to find out our problem areas in our application before we're going to be able to fix those problem areas. This is going to be especially important if you're new to making your app accessible and don't always know those common pitfalls to kind of look out for. look out for. So the first and most important line of defense for accessibility is going to be you. So by manually testing your application with the tools that we've already talked about and other tools in your accessibility settings that other folks might be using to interact with your application, you'll be able to figure out and build some empathy for your users and find out pain points that you might have and be able to fix them before you put that application out for other folks. It's also important for you to be familiar with those tools and experience your app from that perspective. Just like we do with user testing for new features or UIs to make sure the people who are using our app like and understand our application, we can also do user testing to make sure our app is accessible. User testing is, of course, when we get feedback from real people who actually use the app. And then, as I mentioned, when I first got started, I actually worked with a team of accessibility consultants who came in and evaluated our application and told us our different pitfalls as well. And so you do have those kind of third-party user options as well. However, if you have not started implementing accessibility features in your application and immediately dive into user testing, it will be an exercise in frustration. And so it makes sense to probably start with one of the other tools that are automated to call out some of those pitfalls before you start testing with it yourself. Although, of course, noting that nothing will replace feedback from actual people. And so here are some of the different tools that you can use to build an accessible app along the way so that you're in a really good place when you actually need to start testing. So there are several accessibility scanning apps on the Play Store. In this presentation, we'll have an example of the accessibility scanner. The scanner is an app available on the Play Store that scans your app and offers suggestions to improve accessibility of your app, and is produced by Google. They also have a whole suite of other accessibility tools that you can also install to get started with. Additionally, you can use the UI Automator Viewer, which is going to be a convenient GUI that will scan and analyze your UI components that are currently displayed in an Android device. And this can help you build your UI test and also debug when you run into issues. Android Studio also will show lint checks for various accessibility issues like missing content labels. And you can also include accessibility checks into your UI test using the UI framework Espresso. You can enable and configure those accessibility tests using the accessibility checks class, and then it will run every time you run your UI test and remind you and let you know if you added any new accessibility issues. All right, so let's talk about using the accessibility scanner. The accessibility scanner is going to scan your current screen and provide suggestions to improve accessibility of your app based on content label, touch target size, clickable items, and the text and image contrast, all of which we're going to talk a bit about more in depth later in this presentation. You can just find it by going out to the App Store and searching for the accessibility scanner. And then after installing it, you'll find it in the accessibility menu in your settings. When you're ready to start using the accessibility scanner, it's going to ask you for a couple different permissions, which you'll have to provide in order for the app to be allowed to draw over other applications to test their accessibility features. So let's see how it works for a simple application. So this is a really simple app. It just has two edit texts that for a username and repository for GitHub, you can then fetch commits, clear commits, or also refresh commits. And so our commits are just in a list that display our commit message, our author, and a date as well. So let's go ahead and watch the video of how the accessibility scanner will work. So when you install this accessibility scanner and enable it, you'll see this blue check mark on your screen. And so that will, when you click on that, it will give you two different options, record or just take a snapshot. So as you record, you can see how your user moves throughout the screen. In this case, I picked snapshot. And so it took a single view of the screen. And so these orange boxes are going to be different pain points that the user might face. And so as I click into these, I can see the suggestion. So in this case, it says touch target size. And then I can also learn more about that as well. So this one tells me my height is 45 and it needs to be 48. And so by clicking learn more, I can look at implementations, designs, and testing for that particular recommendation. And so I can go through each different recommendation on my screen, and the accessibility scanner will let me know what the problem is, how I can fix it, and more details about each individual problem area. Accessibility scanner is going to be a really good tool, but it's important to remember that it is not perfect. And so some things to call out is that it can only check what's currently on your screen. And so I would often recommend that you actually do use the record option so you can see different states of your screen. And these 3 different screenshots we see, I'm using the accessibility scanner on 3 different states of the exact same application. And different ones, I get different things called out. Oops, went backwards on me. So in the first one, I have these 5 suggestions. These are the ones we just saw. So we know that both username and the repository edit text are going to have the wrong touch target size. The clear button also has the wrong touch target size. And in our bottom right corner, we have a small touch target size and also a missing content label. We see that if I clear out all of those commits in my list item, then my actual recycler view itself is called out as well for a problem because it has no context to it. As well as if you notice the fetch commits button in each one of these, the first and the last have the exact same color contrast, but only the last image is recognized as having a bad color contrast. And so it's just something to remember as you work with these kind of automated tests, is that they're good and a really great place to get started with accessibility. But being mindful, knowing what to look out for is going to help you in the long run to build an entire accessible experience. It is also important to note that you can actually use this with Jetpack Compose, and it works already out of the box, which is awesome, but you might get different results. And so here, the same application now written in Jetpack Compose, we only get 2 suggestions with that basic UI. And so both our clear and our fetch commit button are recognized as having problems, and we'll go a little bit deeper into why that is a little bit deeper later in the presentation. So now that we've kind of looked through some of the accessibility issues that the scanner has picked up in this sample application, let's jump in and talk about solving some of these accessibility suggestions. So we kind of mentioned them when we were looking at the accessibility scanner results, is we're going to talk about things like touch target size, color contrast, accessibility labels, and some of the other accessibility APIs that are available to us. So first off, touch target size. The recommended size for each interactive UI element on your screen, interactive UI focusable area, or touch target size is at least 48 by 48 pixels. However, it does not mean that the UI's visible area has to be 48 by 48, only that the target size for the touch itself is 48 by 48. And so we can achieve this by using a combination of height and padding or width and padding, or we can also use min height and min width to achieve this. The reason that you should care about something like this is if you've ever played a free online mobile game, a really great example of a very small touch target size that is very purposely hard to click, and because it's so to try to encourage you to click on the actual ad itself. And so it can be super frustrating if you're trying to move on, navigate, close something, interact with the UI element to somehow achieve that next step, and you aren't able to do it because the touch target size is too small. So how are we going to decide whether we should be setting a size or a minimum on our different UI elements? So it's really important to use this min height or min width with a wrap content in our XML if it will be some kind of dynamic element. By setting the min height or the min width, it lets our UI become flexible. And so it will automatically kind of adjust or help us adjust for other accessibility issues that could become a problem, and also make our UI really flexible. It will automatically help our text element resize, for example, if you're on a really small device and that might need to wrap around to 2 different lines. or if it's translated to another language and ends up being a longer text than expected in a different language. Or if your user just directly goes into their accessibility settings and changes their text size. By using wrap context, this is going to allow our UI element to automatically expand to the size needed, while also always providing that minimum height of 48 dp for our touch target requirements. It's also super important to remember that localization is also an important part of your accessibility best practices. If you only plan for a single language, then users around the world also will be lacking in those kind of features. It's also important to note that we can't assume out of the box that Android elements will automatically adhere to the correct touch target size. So if we think back to our accessibility scanner, those edit texts were just the standard default edit text with a default text size, and they did not meet our height requirement for touch target size. Whereas our fetch commit button as a button automatically did. And so for our particular example, the edit text we are going to make set to min height and set that to 48 dp, and then it will automatically add the padding that we need to make the element reach the correct height. On the other hand, for our refresh icon in the corner, that is not going to be dynamically sized. And so for this particular one, we can just use our height and width to keep the exact same UI at the end of the day, but increase that touch target size. And so this is one way that you as a developer can automatically work that into your own best practices without having to change your designer's UI to implement those features. And so now if we shift that mindset to Jetpack Compose, we can use the modifiers to achieve the same effect. In Jetpack Compose, modifiers are going to place many of those XML attributes like layout width and layout height and let us modify our composables UI and behavior. So this time on our text fields, if we're considering our Jetpack Compose commit message application, we will again want to make our text fields that dynamic height and width so that they will automatically expand for the same reasons, whether that text needs to wrap around because it got longer in a different language or whether someone changes the text size. And so for this example, we will use the height in example. And so the height in example modifier function is going to have both a minimum and a maximum height that you can add to that function. In our case, we don't need a maximum because we want to let that UI element expand as much as it needs to. Similarly, there's also a width in that you can set a minimum and a maximum, and then we combine that with fill max width to let it fill the screen. Again, for the case of the image that isn't going to change in size, then we can use both the size and a padding modifier to achieve the same effect. We have to, of course, remember that the order of the modifier is going to matter, and since each function makes changes to the modifier returned by the previous function, the sequence is going to affect the end result. And so in this case, we can apply padding before setting the size, but after applying the clickable modifier, so the padding will be added to the size, and the whole element, both padding and size, will be clickable. And you could also achieve the same result by first setting the size that you want plus the padding to the total size you want. So the size you want plus the padding, and then applying the padding afterwards. And this might be a more intuitive way for you to think about padding. Another simple change that you can make is ensuring that your colors meet color contrast requirements. AA compliance requires at least 4.5 to 1 for regular text and 3 to 1 for large text. So this has a couple different examples of kind of what that looks like. So again, 7.62 to 1 is this white image on this darker gray background, whereas on the other side is 2.3 to 1, which makes it much harder to read. A lot of different apps have some kind of branding that they want to stick to, which can make it perhaps scary to update your colors to meet these kind of requirements, but you can use tools like the material color palettes to put in the colors of your different theme and then find other variations of that color for different, that meet different darknesses and brightnesses to make them stick with your color theme, but also meet these color requirements. And if you're wondering how to check your color contrast, there's going to be a lot of tools online that you can put in your foreground color and your background color, and it will spit back out the color contrast ratio of the two. We are currently on the Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 that we mentioned earlier. However, in the upcoming Accessibility Guidelines of version 3, there is going to be a new color contrast method called the Advanced Perceptual Contrast Algorithm, a tongue twister, which is really exciting. Both Apple Interface Guidelines and the Android Accessibility Guidelines still reflect the current web accessibility ratios for recommended color contrast, but this new standard will be probably released sometime in 2023, I think. And so what this is going to do is it's going to replace those ratios with a scale from 1 to 100-ish, and it's going to calculate a score that takes into account things like text color, text size, and font weight as well. And so it's going to be a little bit harder to give this talk and share how to easily figure out your color contrast ratio, but there will still be tools available for it. But it makes more intuitive sense. It offers better recommendations for something like a teal button with white text, which is something I use really often when theming things for Women Who Code Mobile. And next, we're going to talk about labels and hints on our different UI elements, which should be a very straightforward in practice, but it can have some tricky edge cases at times. The basics of adding labels is that each UI element in your app should include a description that describes the element's purpose. Here in Android, we do that using the content description, although we get some for those for free on some elements. For example, we usually do not need to provide a description for a text view because Android Accessibility Framework will automatically announce the text as a description of that UI element. When we think about some best practices for labels, first off, we want to use the right UI element. You get a lot of different things for free. Next, we don't want to include the UI element in the description because as long as we follow that first best practice, it will include the UI element automatically. And descriptions should be unique. If we have two different UI elements that have the same label, it makes it confusing for where a user might be within that different page or where they might be in the application. And then also we want to skip over decorative effects because someone does have to sit and listen through each different label to navigate around your application. Again, we mentioned localization a little bit earlier, is our labels and our content descriptions need to be localized so that those accessibility labels are available to everyone, concise, so that someone can quickly move through your application, and descriptive what the element will be. Similarly, why do you care about content descriptions? I am personally loving where we are with social media is that some of these accessibility features are really getting ingrained and added to a lot of the different content that we share online. So if we think about things like TikToks and Instagram Reels and videos otherwise shared across the internet, we often hear that robotic woman's voice announcing some kind of description of what's happening in the video. I'm not totally sure if this sound will come through, but I will give it a try.
Show me someone that lives in your house rent-free.
What an adorable cat. And so this video I particularly like because you do get that woman's voice that sounds a lot like the voiceover available through the Android Accessibility Framework. And then it also includes a content description. So this is already showing up in our social media and becoming part of our culture as well.
Show me someone that lives.
So like every good developer will tell you, if you ask me a question, does it need something? The answer will always be, it depends. But in general, we have some kind of guidelines that we can kind of get started with. So in general, text views shouldn't need a label because the accessibility framework will automatically read the text as the description, whereas something like an edit text should include a hint on it most of the time. An image button is something that we will almost always need a label on to give it context for the voiceover framework. And image view, again, that one's going to be a maybe for us. Depends if it adds context or adds important descriptions to the screen, or is it just a decorative element to make your app UI a little bit prettier? And again, something like a text button, similar to a text view, is probably not going to need a button all the time. And some questions we can ask ourselves as we're developing our application is, can it be skipped? And question that goes with that is that a decorative element? Should it be grouped together? Are those different things going to make more sense together? And how will it be read out? So when we think about things like text views and text buttons that are generally no, we have to think about, is it going to include numbers or abbreviations that need some kind of other modification to make them make sense to our users? There's a lot of different reasons to use the right UI element beyond accessibility. It gives you a lot more out of the box as a developer. We can talk about something like a button, for example, that's going to automatically style with the correct accent color, going to give it some elevation to make it look clickable. It's going to make your text in caps automatically. But again, with respect to the topic of accessibility, it also has those features for accessibility already built in from the framework. And so by using that button instead of a clickable text view, if you will, we get things like that UI element added automatically, the correct size for the touch target size. In Compose, on the other hand, buttons offer a lot more flexibility, but do have a couple gotchas. So for example, by default, the Jetpack Compose button is actually a minimum height of 36. We saw earlier that when we did do that scan over the Jetpack Compose app, both our fetch commits button and our refresh and our clear button were both labeled, had suggestions from our accessibility scan. And that's because they're both only set to 36 by default. But on the other hand, Jetpack Compose does give you some flexibility to create really complex button elements, given that that final argument is content, which means that you can use that button element as your base composable and easily create those beautiful complex buttons that you need. And you see that a lot in other UI elements in Compose as well. Additionally, Material Designs builds their own styled composables library that's going to be built on top of those core composables. And those material design buttons are designed with accessibility in mind, and so they will by default be set to 48 by 48. Something that I found awesome about Jetpack Compose is the developers' attentiveness to building in accessibility as they built out those composables. And so the icon button is actually set to 48 by 48 to meet the touch target requirements. And above that icon button, where they're setting that size in the source code, you'll actually see a to-do that says investigate our strategy around accessibility touch targets and remove these per component's definition of size. And so I thought that was a really special way for something really special to see in the code base, is that they're thinking about these sorts of things. With something like an edit text, we mentioned that they're going to need something like a hint. And so we had both the username and as an edit text and the repository as an edit text. It's common for an edit text element to have some kind of corresponding view that could describe the contents of the edit text element itself. And so we can achieve this kind of UI by having a text view or some other kind of view and using the XML attribute label for. And so in this case, we have label for user input, and that's going to pair that text view with the edit text. So the accessibility framework knows that the text view describes the contents of the edit text. Similarly, we could also use the hint XML attribute on the edit text, which will automatically display something, an example text inside of your edit text when it's empty. And so this is a different way that we can also give that edit text context. We do not want to use both label for and hint at the same time, because each UI element should only have a single label to describe its contents. So you can have that text view above separately for your UI purposes, but you should only have a single hint or label for to tell the accessibility framework what that edit text is. We can also consider grouping our different labels together out of the box. If we think about our recycler view with all of those commits, it's going to read each individual recycler view element as one continuous label and include the position in that list. So if we think about the commit message list, it's going to read out the commit message, the author, the date, and then tell you 1 out of 30 when you go through that list. However, that's not always going to be what we are going to want our recycler view to behave as. There might be some situations where there's something important in each different element that they will want to interact with. And so we can use the screen reader focusable on the different UI elements for it to be read out separately. And so we think about this being the constraint layout for that message, author, and date. We can say, I really want my message to be read out separately. And so I add that XML attribute screen reader focusable true on that particular element. Similarly, if we're in some kind of UI element that we do want to make read together. I think the Google example of this is a CD and an artist, something that really makes sense together because there could be many different CDs with the same name but different artists. And so grouping them together gives them the full context. Then we can instead put that screen reader focusable true on the top level container and focusable false on individual elements that we would like to be skipped over. And so this would read them all together as one element when we use our screen reader. And finally, there might be times when you want to read the container itself and the individual elements. I think a really good example of that for this is something like a calendar view, your calendar, a week view that would have a header, a container that might say Wednesday and individual elements inside of it. And so we would want to give our users an easy way to kind of skip over different days that don't matter to them at that given time. And so to achieve that, we just add that screen reader focusable true and don't combine it with those focusable falses for the elements inside. So let's talk about the same sorts of things with Jetpack Compose. So first, in some composables, we're actually going to have access to the content description directly as part of the function arguments. And so this we'll see in things like the image composables and also the different icon composables. Again, I think this is a really nice feature of Jetpack Compose because it really forces developers to think about including content descriptions as they write their applications instead of as an afterthought. I think it's way too easy to just skip over those lint warnings when you're writing it in your XML. And so we also notice that the content description is a nullable string. So we see string question mark. Like we talked about earlier, not every image is going to need a content description. And so that can be set to null in the correct cases for that element to be skipped over by the screen reader. If we look at our text views, we again have a really similar two different choices. We have both a placeholder and a label. The placeholder text is like a hint. And so it will show in the text field itself when there is no input. And the label behaves more like the label for, where it will kind of appear both in the text field when it's empty, and then as you click into it, it will jump above. It's also still important to only use one or the other. In the case of a text field, if you have both label and placeholder set inside the composable function itself, the label will always take priority, and you will always see and hear the label being read, and the placeholder will essentially be ignored. Again, similar to an edit text, you can always create the UI you want with that label above it if needed, and using that placeholder in the text field itself. So now to talk about some of these other things, we have to switch gears and talk about semantics. Compose is going to use semantic properties to pass informations to accessibility services and also to your unit test or to your UI test. Semantic properties provide information about UI elements that are displayed to the user. Much like height and width, the semantic properties are added using the modifier. When we mentioned that you generally don't need to add content descriptions to things like a text field, but sometimes you do. Content description is a semantic modifier that you can always access and add on any different composable. So this is a list of some semantic modifiers. There are more in the Compose. Again, something I like about Compose is you can actually look at that semantics property file and see all the different options you have, as well as some descriptions above them of times you might want to use them. And I think that's a really nice feature for developers to kind of wrap your head around different situations where you might need to have accessibility concerns. And so we will talk about some of these in depth to kind of match those XML examples we showed, but I also wanted to call out a few here. So as mentioned, content description, you can add a content description to anything. Heading, much like the web, you can mark certain text as headings so that folks can navigate more quickly around your application. One that I personally am excited about and really like is live region. And so this is going to handle something that updates in the UI and needs to be read out as it happens. And it has different options of how aggressively it should read out those changes. If you did the Android Dev Build Challenge back in June of last year and build a countdown timer, this might be a good use for the semantic property of live region. We also have role. We already talked about how important using the correct UI element to build our views is, because choosing that right element is going to give the accessibility some properties that it can automatically infer about that element. Role was added as a semantic modifier, and it means that you can add these to composables, and it will automatically infer those semantic properties of that particular role to your custom composable. So some of the different roles it can have is a button, a checkbox, as well as like a few others, switch, radio button, tab, and image as well. And so let's look at some of these a little bit more in depth. So we can combine our views and compose as well by using the merge descendants. So by adding merge descendants to this column, the commit, the author, and the date will all be read together. Similarly, we can add a content description to our container. And so by adding the semantics modifier to the column and adding that container, it will be read separately, and then individual elements will be read inside that container as well. There's going to be a lot of tools to help as you kind of build out your different labels. So in XML, we have things like label 4, screen reader focusable, accessibility heading, and in Jetpack Compose, we have all of our semantic properties. There's also some other classes that can help. So TTS span is a special type of span that you can pass metadata in that will give it context for how to pronounce it. And so by using something like type digit in TTS span, it will change something from 123 million to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There are a couple other things that we can talk about a little bit more in depth, or you can explore on your own, which is things like different displays, how to handle custom views with the accessibility APIs, and some other thoughts for other media. So we already talked briefly about how by just using our minimum height for both Compose and XML, we can automatically kind of add in those features for large text size. I also always call out that dark mode is actually an accessibility feature. I know that with developers, it is often a popular first choice. So by supporting dark mode, you're both adding that accessibility feature in and helping a large base of audience. Finally, a couple different accessibility APIs that you can add to custom views. We can add custom actions to our different elements in our UI and programmatically by using add accessibility action. So we can use this for things like swipe to delete, which is not an actual button, but is something that is a really common pattern. They also have support for spans with links by using enable accessible clickable span support. And we can also tell the accessibility framework how custom views might behave with something like pane title to let it know that this particular view that you've made for your application should behave like an alert view. Those also exist in Jetpack Compose, and so we can do pane title to mimic the pane, the previous accessibility pane title. We can use pane title inside our semantics modifier, and similarly, we can add custom actions to different composables using a list of custom accessibility actions. If you remember a cat video, if you are including other media in your application, you should consider things like changing the volume, adding the ability to toggle the subtitles, or some other way to read the information that you provide, as well as ways to stop, pause, and go back through the video as well. And finally, with UI testing, we already mentioned that with several different accessibility you can add accessibility checks using UI frameworks like Espresso. You can easily add those using the accessibility checks.enable, and so it will call out the same kind of pitfalls that this accessibility scanner calls out. So we'll call out things like color contrast, the touch target size, color. I already said color contrast as well. The semantics modifiers are all available for those UI tests as well, but you will have to write your own individual tests to test those different features. And so with that, what's next? I mentioned the version 3 of the accessibility guidelines is going to be published in 2023. They are currently in draft 1. You can expect them to kind of move away from these different tiers to more of a grading scale to kind of meet you where you are. And so instead of saying you're at AA, you'll likely get some kind of score like a 60% to let you know that you can still improve and you have a little bit more flexibility there. If you want to learn more about Android accessibility, I recommend Android Accessibility by Tutorials by Victoria Gonda. And finally, if you're getting started with Compose and accessibility, I really recommend going and trying out the Jetpack Compose Accessibility Code Lab to kind of get your hands dirty in code. And so with that, thank you so much for listening. If you want to find me, I'm on Twitter _OBryan, or a whole host of ways to get in touch with me at cobryan.dev. Ooh.
Okay, that was fun. I think a bunch of us really enjoyed that there was some expression of how accessibility works in a Jetpack Compose world. I personally haven't played around Jetpack Compose that much, but it's been kind of an idea that's been gnawing at the back of my head. Like, I really hope they make it a little bit, more, better integrated.
I think it is. I've been really pleased with it so far. I think that you've seen almost all the features ported over from XML attributes and the accessibility APIs into Jetpack Compose. And new ones added as well, which is really awesome.
Nice. I'm gonna add that. Let's give everybody a couple, let's say 2 minutes. Just add your questions to the Q&A area. Upvote questions that you think are interesting, and then we're gonna go through them. And then Sierra will go through them at the end of the time. Does that work for you, Sierra?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Nice. Yeah, there was a important conversation stoked by I believe you had a dog that passed through the back.
I do.
Yeah, it started a long thread about cats versus dogs.
Controversial. I agree.
Yeah. But yeah. Okay. Seems like there's some progress going on in there. I see some things being shuffled around according to voting. Yep. All right. I guess whenever you're ready, go for it, Sierra.
I didn't pay enough attention to this tab. I had it in the chat. I saw everyone commenting about cats and dogs. I was like, no questions. Perfect. But now I realize. How have you educate designers about how to build accessible designs? I think color contrast is one of the biggest pain points. And I think that using those material design tools that already exist is probably the best way to kind of educate them on. And then also, I think educating people on why it's so important to care about it, because I will not pretend to understand like everything about building accessible designs themselves. I'm not a designer. You just saw my sample application. It has nothing in it. So educating them on the reasons to care about that so that they can find their own resources is probably a really good start as well. My favorite accessibility feature is one I haven't used yet, but I am really, really excited about this live region. I work on an application that does have a major timer component and a feature that often updates to provide meaningful information to our users. And we have spent a lot of time debating how to make that more accessible. And so right now, it is written in XML. It was written before Jetpack Compose. But I think that migrating that to Jetpack Compose and using that live region is going to be the best option. And like I mentioned, that live region actually has different settings as well. And so there's like an aggressive or like a polite. I think those are the two words that they use to indicate the level of aggression that it should use. And so you have options as well of, should it only update if your focus is currently on that view versus if it's just on the screen in general. And so I think that is just a really cool feature. I'm really excited to try it out. I have not needed to be certified for the accessibility guidelines. So have you need to be certified? And if so, what is that process like? I do know some folks who have gone through it and work as accessibility consultants. At the end of the day, my primary role is an Android developer, and so that hasn't been super important, and just having some really good best practices in mind kind of is enough to get us started, and pulling in those experts when needed has been enough for me. But if you want to be put in touch with some people who have gone through that process, I would be happy to make that introduction. I know, Tyler, we follow each other on Twitter, so you have my contact information. So the next question is, where would you draw the line between user preference and accessibility? For example, light dark mode could be considered a personal preference. I think a lot of accessibility features are often considered personal preferences for someone who doesn't need that different accessibility option. So I'd really encourage going through the different features in the accessibility settings, because that will probably tell you what the accessibility framework and the folks at Google are saying these are accessibility features versus things that you and I might just have a preference about. And so again, by incorporating those features, it's going to automatically make the rest of your user base who does consider that just a personal preference of whether they use light mode or dark mode, happier campers as well. So building that app that's going to be better for everyone. My question is there a tool used for testing accessibility? Both Espresso and Roboelectric both have accessibility checks built in. And so they do recommend Espresso. Roboelectric has Roboelectric. I always want to say Roboelectric. Roboelectric has some known issues. And so it cannot be your only line of defense or your only test. But Espresso is really cool because when you initialize all your UI tests, there's just an option there. It's accessibility checks.enable. And so every element that it tests for those UI tests, it will also double check for those common accessibility pitfalls. So as it goes through your UI to navigate through, make sure your flow works, it will check each individual element for things like color contrast, whether you include a content description, whether it has the right touch target size, where applicable. So far in Jetpack Compose, and I would love someone to tell me I'm wrong about this, I see that every time I give this talk, is the semantics are really what you use to write your UI tests, but as far as I can tell, you cannot automate them in the same way that you can with the XML test. And I think that's kind of a downfall because it's a really, really nice feature to get you started and remind you every time you run your unit test, your UI test, that you've added something new or you've introduced some kind of pain point that you should double check. I think that is such a nice feature that's integrated into the Espresso tests. Okay, if we have a text field with a custom label to visually replace the hint, should we still add the hint? Is this where the content description of the text field gets taken from? So that is somewhat a personal option. I would often recommend it. But what you can't do is have the label for and the hint at the same time. You can only have one or the other because you should only consider one of those to be the unique identifier of that text field or edit text. So, and so some UIs, you always want to have that label above and also an example of what that text looks like. So for something like an email, it makes sense to have email above and then also Sierra@example.com in the hint. In that case, I would not use label for the actual label, and the user will just be able to navigate through and hear both of those read out. If you use label for, then you do not want to add a hint because again, it can only have one. And that will be where the hint is where the content description of the edit text or text field will come from. And finally, will the accessibility scanner work on an app developed in Flutter? And that is a great question that I do not know the answer to. And I don't think I have any Flutter apps on my current devices, but I do not know that answer. I've never tried it. And I will probably try it as soon as we get off this call. Really good question that I do not know.
Okay, well, seems like there are no other questions. I'm just looking through the
Oh, Todd said it does not work with a Flutter app. So someone did in fact know from the audience.
Oh, sweet. You got a conclusive answer.
Mm-hmm.
Assuming you trust Todd, which I would highly recommend being suspect of anything Todd says.
I will try it as soon as I get off this call and follow up.
Okay, well, Sierra, that was a lovely talk. I hope that some engineers come out of here and have an easier time incorporating accessibility into their engineering. Thank you so much for presenting this topic. It's such an important one for engineers to know about, and to think about as they're building any UI. Okay. If you have any last words, then I'll go for it. Otherwise,
thank you all for bearing with me. Had a great time.
Bye, folks.